Hey, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak with you all today to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do, some of the ways that we look and approach at policy, and some of the ways that how we like to think of policy innovations, but also I think from that incredible introduction that Stephanie just had about the big P and small p of policy and looking at this from a completely holistic component of it, that all of it sort of interwoven together and all informs each other as part of it. A little bit about the Intertribal Agriculture Council because it really speaks to the approach that we take when we're building policy and really what sort of efforts that go into that. The Intertribal Agriculture Council was founded in 1987 at the heels of the farm financial crisis in the 1980s, which folks may be familiar with, where farmers across the country were facing financial and fiscal cliffs based upon some of the market realities. And USDA and the federal government and Congress had to respond by putting different policies in place. There was a report that was done that looked at some of the particular harms that tribal producers faced and how they were faring worse than most other producers in this. And so based upon that analysis and study, it was recommended that there was the creation of a particular organization that provides not only direct assistance and support, but also works on supporting policy developments for Native producers. And that's really where the intertribal agriculture was born out of, that sort of idea that there was inequities or an unequitable process or service to tribal producers. And when we sort of look at the history and creation of USDA and the history of agriculture in the United States as we see it now, that's not surprising. USDA, was founded in 1862, really coming off of the idea of tribal land takings and cessions, the homesteading acts that opened up for westward expansion, and also the creation of the state land grant system and education system, which provided education to producers, but not producers of color. So when we're looking at what USDA's foundational policies were, tribal producers, and I would say all producers of color, weren't envisioned as original stakeholders in that. So going forward to those programs where food and agriculture have been staples of tribal communities since time immemorial, being able to try to fight to be a part of USDA programs to have access to that type of funding and support are things that the IAC really is supportive of. So because of where tribal agriculture is and was where it was recognized to be, what were some of the main concerns and issues going into the creation of the IAC and looking at how USDA addressed that? One of the largest components that we have, in addition to some of the policy work, is we have technical assistance agents that work directly with producers on the ground. And this is a little bit unique in that directly informs the policy work that we do. So in that work, being able to work with producers, we are able to see exactly what are some of the concerns and issues that they're facing, what programs they can access, what funding isn't being applied to them, what opportunities they're being given or not given, and then be able to translate that at the federal level to talk about, okay, is this something that can be addressed via USDA? Is this something that needs to go to Congress? And so it's really no mistake about the 1990 Farm Bill that tribes were mentioned for the first time. And to go, I think, a little bit into this is, we're in a place now, particularly where this new administration is talking a lot about equity and inclusion and support to show just how far this has kind of come. In 1989, the very first executive director of the Intertribal Agriculture Council met with the Secretary of Agriculture with several tribal leaders with him. And so when the IAC Executive Director, Greg Smitman, and the tribal leaders were talking with the Secretary about the importance of tribal agriculture, some of the difficulties and concerns that their producers were having on the ground, how they could be able to best support them and work with them, the Secretary of Agriculture got up out of his chair, walked to the window, pointed in the direction of the Department of the Interior all the way down the mall, and said, "I'm sorry, you're in the wrong building. We don't do that here." So now, when we're looking at what equity looks like, what inclusion looks like, we need to take that idea of agriculture and USDA not being structured and centered around the realities of tribal agriculture to how it needs to be restructured and redone. And so one of the things that we really fight for and push for is that seat at the table, but also a voice in the process, and a voice in the process as early as possible. Tribes, as sovereign governments, have a unique and direct nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government and need to be consulted not just during the creation of federal policies, but actually in their genesis and creation, even before they go out to notice. Tribal producers need to be looked at as continuous stakeholders in these programs. And so from that perspective, and with the work that IAC has done over the last several farm bills and leading up to the 2018 Farm Bill, we were able to put together a coalition, which we call the Native Farm Bill Coalition. But it started in research and information gathering. So the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community, which is a tribe that is located just outside of St. Paul, Minneapolis, recognized through their Seeds of Native Health campaign that there is a very big need for a push for federal policy. So they reached out to the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, and several other organizations, and said, can you put together a report and some data regarding tribal agriculture and federal policy components? So we worked with our former director of the IFAI, who's Janie Simsip, who's now fortunately being considered for nomination for USDA's General Counsel. And folks, I know there's probably a lot of folks that have worked with Janie or are friends with Janie, and when you ask Janie for information, you get information. So together we put together a Regaining Our Future report that's over 144 pages that walks through the history of tribal agriculture, some of the things that have been asked for before, went through each of the 12 titles of it, pulled data and statistics about what could be the potential impact, and then looked at what opportunities exist in policy. And through that engagement, we were able to work with tribal governments across the country, tribal organizations across the country, and partners and allies. And so from that, we created this Native Farm Bill Coalition. Currently, there's over 170 tribes represented in that, 17 national tribal organizations, and 3 allied organizations as well too. So we took this research that was really driven and tribally driven to kind of show where some of the gaps were. Developed from that some of the policy recommendations, put together sort of one-pagers and informational information so to be able to display that and have that conversation, and also propose solutions for it as well. This wasn't without its own challenges, and with that, part of that was being able to really help translate the data in research, which is something that we, I think, in sometimes our own world get a little bit, I think it's a little bit tough to think about. Everyone that works in particular areas all have their own federal government programs, shorthand for things and acronyms, and they're a whole own alphabet soup that you're sort of swimming in with it. Sometimes it's easier to be able to shorthand explain something, or like you're looking at what would be considered a basic concept that actually needs to be explained a little bit further when talking to a lawmaker. And so really thinking about what these mean in these contexts, kind of breaking them down and then building them back up with this type of data. One of the things that we also saw while we were doing this is that across all of the federal government data that was available and studies that have been done, there's very little information regarding some of the impact and supportive programs regarding tribal governments or tribal producers or tribal communities. So in a lot of times, like we were looking at sort of either no data or very limited data to be able to tell that story. And since with so many researchers here and folks that are fully engaged on this, how important that data is to telling that story and to showcasing why these policy changes need to happen. So we really focused on that. And to kind of underscore this of what this really looks like from an equity lens, in a not so distant component of this, one of the things that we saw during the last election was they were breaking down voter data. They were doing it, by race and ethnicity, and they listed all the way down. And the very last category was something else. Didn't include Native Americans, but was something else. So there was a large campaign done by folks at Illuminative and other Native organizations talking about the invisibility of tribal data that's really sort of captured in this idea of not spelling it out, but putting it into a separate category and it not actually being explained. And so our work was really to try to look at and show and highlight what that data is, who is being impacted, and then what needs to happen to support them in that information. So when we were going forward with this, that was really sort of the intention and focus of it, is to ensure that those that didn't have a voice in this did, and they were able to showcase that. Another big component of that too was trying to be able to tell the stories as well too. And some of the work that we've done, being able to take those policy data ideas and even taking some of the larger scale, you know, language tweaks and breakdowns and black letter law that you're trying to develop and write out, and being able to tweak it and showcase why it's important, can sometimes lose some of its impact in translation. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure that was there were the stories. Who is this going to impact? Why is this important? And that direct connection to tribal producers on the ground, to tribal leaders on the ground, and also to tribal youth who are engaged in their communities regarding this, are really powerful ways to be able to tell the stories of what was going on. Because oftentimes when you're trying to have these conversations, you can have all the data that you have there, you can have all the research, you can have the really good analysis showing why it's on there. But from our perspective, being able to point it directly to the ground by saying, if you make this change in law, then this producer will be able to support their family and help feed their community better. If you're able to make this tweak or change, this opens up a whole world of opportunities that didn't exist before. And so much of this sometimes gets caught into trying to prove and analyze this, but being able to have those sort of representative stories, representative information, we found to be very, I think, big components of the things that we were looking to be able to put forward. From the work that we were able to do with this, we were very fortunate to have 63 tribal specific provisions included in the 2018 Farm Bill, which was an incredible win. And I would say probably the largest and largest component of that was the extension of what we can call tribal self-governance, which would be the ability for a tribal government to contract or compact with the federal government to run and manage a program to help serve its citizens. That authority was extended via a couple of pilot projects to USDA for the very first time. And that is in a food distribution program called FDIPR, or the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, which again gets into that alphabet soup and also that federal government challenge where you can have as many consonants as you want in an acronym and still find a way to pronounce it. So we were able to do that. And what that does is it allows for localized purchasing of food by those sites to be able to contract with local and hopefully native producers on food that could be traditional foods that are traditional to those regions and those citizens that are served by that program, that then help and support those producers get access to a federal government program, and to be able to help build their capacity going forward. That was also included in forestry management as well too, but it's a big first step being able to say, when we're looking at an equity lens, and I would also say from a governmental equity lens, of how do we help and support tribal governments and tribal producers have access and be as successful with programs as possible. From that, while that was a very successful effort, I always like to think of any policy effort and any legislative wins and components as being about 49% of the effort. And it has to be on that 51% of the effort is really on the implementation of that. How is the USDA going to take that change, implement it? Are they going to do it with the congressional intent and the ways that support that? So we're still working through those components, even though we are a little over 2 years past the passing of the last Farm Bill. Even going forward with a new administration, particularly one that is very engaged and supportive of racial equity and inclusion, tribal governmental equity and inclusion, and I'll also say tribal consultation, as that was also one of the first executive orders that was released by President Biden. Also looking at ways to inform federal policy and end those conversations as well. And one of the things that we're so often caught in, and this goes back to the history of how USDA was created, how the programs are structured, how some of the policy even now is being developed and putting out there. Without having tribal representation at the table, without having tribal leaders at the table, without having tribal producers at the table, these policies are already developed and set. And so the only time to react to them is when they're either publicly released or almost already fully in written form to be able to fully react to them. So where we're always left is we're left in a position to where we're trying to fit sort of the square peg of tribal agriculture into a round policy hole that was never, ever developed or considered to be looked at from that angle or lens. So when we are in these processes and we're thinking about equity, it goes beyond just saying, oh, we need to get tribes in the room, or we need to get these stakeholders in the room. Oh, we should see what they think about what we put together. It really needs to start as early as the process as possible, at the very beginning of the process as possible, and at the very sort of genesis of that discussion. Without that sort of component where you're actually developing the intent, the structure of it, we're always going to be left at the end, sort of backfilling what should have happened in the beginning. And no matter if we're able to get as many changes as possible, or the things that we want to be able to tweak it, we're still left with a process to where that creation and that structure of a program may not be the one that's going to be most helpful for the stakeholders or communities that we serve. It may not be the one that's actually going to make the changes necessary. It may be a couple steps forward, but it may not be that big policy leap that was possible with all the information and data that you have, with all the research that was done, with all the stories that was gathered. So when we're looking at doing this, it's really about building and establishing those relationships. But I would say it's really focused on that creation of how do we actually engage in this process and have all the stakeholders who are going to be impacted from these types of legislation put forward and be part of the process. So with that, those are the things that we work for and fight for on behalf of our tribal governments and tribal producers every day, and work with so many other stakeholders across the landscape of trying to support both equity and inclusion for everyone in federal programming. And so with that, glad to turn it over, and thank you very much for having me here, and look forward to any questions and conversation.